being polite. Okay, my name's Veronica King Jamieson. We're going to get started. Just want to say Ani. Do you know what Ani means? Anybody? Scanaway. Everybody say Ani.
Ani.
Nana Bojo.
Nana Bojo.
In English, it's almost equivalent to, it's a greeting. So welcome everyone here. So we're going to get started. I'm going to ask Elder Gary Sue to do the opening. Elder Gary Sue.
Bonjour. Renogida. That means it's a good day. We're here, we're going to look at the past, present, and the future. And Nanabush gave us his Nanabush greeting. And, but he had a brother, and his name was Chibiavos. And Chibiavos excuse me. Spoke to the spirit, the past, the present, and the future. And the way he did that was he made a personal drum, a drum that you could communicate with the worlds. Okay, TV. Twins. Hey. In the past. The ways of the Anishinaabe are sadly being neglected and not being carried on in the true sense of the history of the Anishinaabe people. And as much as when Pierre Elliott Trudeau said to our chiefs, your treaties have expired, the chief said, I guess your lease is up. I always look at, they try to say if you don't know your custom, you don't know your language, then we consider you assimilated and no longer an Aboriginal person. They neglect. They come and they try to make inroads to us. We will have the truth and reconciliation. And there's a lot of words, but no action. And the reason to both sides of the people that made them. The Crown, I went to, did a treaty week, and I went to universities, I went to schools, I went to grade 4s and 5s, and I would always ask this question: who is the Crown? And their answer invariably was the King. And I said, so they really don't know their own governorship. And if you don't know that, then how are you supposed to be able to talk about the treaties when you know nothing about them? And I can understand that from my heart, because I was just looking at how sadly they treated us, and how there is no honor to the Crown. And there can be none of that unless they start to understand their responsibility. And one of the things that you have to do is recreate history for them, because they've taken it out of the curriculum. So how are you even going to get any kind of an action from the next generation if it's not mandatory for them to know what the treaties are? It could be done in grade 10 civics. It opens their mind to some of the responsibilities of who they are. And we, too, on our own side of the picture, are the same way. We need to start to embrace the history from the past, so we can make it come alive in the present and in the future. So when you say you want truth and reconciliation, there can be no reconciliation until the people of Canada understand the treaties legally.
Chief Rich, Elder Gary Sue. Next on the agenda, who do we have? Chief.
Oh.
You. I see you on your cell phone, you need to put that away.
Thank you. I don't know if I should say this, but I'm going to anyway. See, Elder Sue was in pain because he forgot to bring some medicines today for himself. And instead of going home and looking after himself, he chose to stay and fulfill his responsibilities as an elder. So I think I'd like to say a good chin up and a round of applause for him. No, not too much, because you got to applaud for me later, and please be well. Sorry, I'm just kidding. So, I apologize for my disheveled look. See, I'm having a late in life crisis, and I'm trying to grow my hair back to when I was young. The problem is that when my hair was long, it was actually a mullet. And my wife said, there's no way in heck I'm bringing that back, so we'll see. Ani, was you Nagani Nishnabek and any States Reform Disnakas, Credit Dunjaba, Mainda Dodum, Mississauga, Nishnaway Dao. Over time, you'll come to understand that that's the way we introduce ourselves, and you'll recognize some of the language because you'll probably hear it a lot. So we have a relationship with U of G, of course, and we have a relationship with Massey College. And so the students at Massey have, because I once said to them, you know, it'd be nice, as the treaty holders of this land, if when we meet people, they could introduce themselves in our language. And so they've taken me up on that challenge, and now they're learning Anishinaabe language. I would offer the same thing to you, but don't learn it too quickly because I'm trying to reclaim mine, and I can't have you speaking it better than me. So I'd like to acknowledge the Creator, the world around us, our place within it. I'd like to acknowledge all of you for being here. I'd like to acknowledge the elder. I'd like to acknowledge Deputy Grand Chief of the Anishinaabe Nation is here and joined us. Also a Mississauga member. Where's he from? I forget. I'm serious, I forgot where he's from. Alderville, yeah. So the Mississaugas are Credit, Mississaugas, Curve Lake, Alderville, Hiawatha, and Mississauga 8 and Skugok make up the six Mississauga communities who make up the Mississauga Nation. And there are about 10,000 of us, must be close to 10 by now. I think it's more like 9, but I expect a cold winter and a dedicated people. They won't let me down. So, I'm going to tell this story, and I know a lot of you have heard it before, but it's important that I keep telling it, I think. So, I was in the store one day, and I dress like this a lot because I have a lot of ribbon shirts. See, I originally got my first ribbon shirt, because I want to respect tradition, but also because whenever I have a ribbon shirt on, I don't have to wear a suit. So whenever there's something that says, suit and tie or business attire, I put on a ribbon shirt. What does it say? They don't know what to say. Yes. So that's why I bought it. But the other reason I have ribbon shirts is because we're still here, and people need to know that. And if they see us, they need to know there's a culture behind it. So I was in the store one day, and a man says, "Nice shirt." I said, "Thank you." And I was actually wearing this very shirt. And he goes, "It takes a special kind of man to wear a shirt like that." So I chuckled and said, "Thank you." But this was right before the North American Indigenous Games. And I had to speak to do the opening of the games. And we're surrounded all the way around by the youth from across the land, the Indigenous youth. And what he said to me reminded me of this, and I was able to tell them that at that next day or two. We should never have to change to fit into society. The world around us should adapt to embrace our uniqueness. And it was a good message to be able to share with them, and it's a good message to be able to share with you because it's applicable to all of us. And at this time in the world, it's important. So now I got a bit of a speech. I wrote this at 5 this morning, so hang on. So, here we go. So, politicians are only as strong as we allow them to be. And by being here, you understand this truth. They have taken, and I'm not talking about one specific politician. I'm talking about people in general around this world who lead this world now. There's a sense that their ideology and their beliefs are the only beliefs and the only way forward. But as I said, they have no strength without us. And by being here, we're having this conversation, you understand that. See, there will come a day when all of us will make hard decisions about who we are. Are we a cog in a wheel that grinds along, who lives day to day? Or are we a people of conviction, who have strong beliefs in justice and in right and wrong? Beliefs that do not bend and break in the wind. The voice of anger, fear, and divisiveness the world over is becoming so loud that we sometimes question who we are as a people and what the world stands for. I know who we are, and I know what we believe in. We will stand in the light, we will stand in the dark, but we will never stand alone, nor should we, because we must all stand together. We will not leave the fate of our children in the hands of those who teach divisiveness and hate. Now, the world has always known hate and fear, but it has always been pushed back by love and unity. This will not be easy. Anger and hate have taken a strong hold in our world. And this is not a war that we can send our soldiers to fight. This is a battle that we must all accept. To stand for what we believe, we must understand our vision for ourselves, our children, and our future. It's what our ancestors did. It's what our warriors did. It's what we are called to do. I ask everyone here and all over the world to embrace their courage and conviction. It's time to show everyone, the world, to show humanity. It is not just the loud, angry voices that hold sway. There is a voice of welcoming, of reason, of acceptance, of love. Now, I know you've all chosen to be here to do what is needed in education, but education is a small thing. It's a big thing for us, but it's a small thing in the context of what we're dealing with. There's also environment issues, racism, hate. All are symptoms of a much bigger problem. You know, I've always believed that we need to address the immediate issues, but we cannot afford to lose sight of the fact that we are in a trying time in our world, where we are called upon to stand up and hold our head high and say what we believe in. Even if you find yourself alone, you have to do that, because if we do not, we will lose this world to small-minded. I better not go too far. To small-minded pettiness. You know, I know who I am, and I know who you are. I see you, I appreciate you, and I thank you. I was trying to learn how to say I see you in the Anishinaabe right before this, but I forgot. I didn't write it down. So, I was going to read you a poem about inclusivity, but Veronica beat me to it and put it in the paper. So now it'd be anticlimactic to read it. Thank you, Veronica. However, I do have a fallback, and I know if I'm speaking too long, Veronica will tell me. So I have a poem here that I want to read, and it's about Mother Earth, and it's from the perspective of the earth, because if you're talking about reconciliation, as the elder was, you're talking about understanding that reconciliation just isn't a human thing. It's an all of us thing, that includes all the animals and the land itself. So I'd like to read you a poem called Mother, and I wrote it from the perspective of the earth. Why do you hurt me when I have nothing but love for you? I have seen you crawl from the dark into the light. I have watched you learn to walk and then to fly. I have seen you squabble and fight. I have cheered for you, and I have feared for you. I give freely what is mine to give, yet you take more than I am able. You hurt me. More and more you ignore my pain and my cries. I am ancient, but I am not immortal. I have a time. Why do you seek to rob me of it? Through the years I've been here for you and yours, for your grandmothers and their grandmothers and their grandmothers. I would stay to see your children raise their children, but I cannot, for I am dying. I do not measure the passing of time as you do. Nevertheless, I know my time is coming, and it is soon. I love you, my children, but I fear I will fail you. And even though you have failed me first, anger is not in me, for I was created of love, as were you. Therefore, the toughest part of goodbye is knowing that you cannot go on without me, that your time will end far too soon, and no one will know. This great journey, this grand adventure called humanity, will be undone as if it never existed. I will care for you as long as I am able. Yet when the rivers no longer flow, when the trees die, when the wind rages and the storms come, know that it is not my anger. It is the end of the love I can no longer give, the love you can no longer take. It is my end, and sadly, it is yours. You can applaud. we must teach consciousness, because we need that more than ever. And I'm hopeful that that's what you will do. Human would have a great conference.
Okay, next on the agenda, I have a youth representative here. So the theme was the past, the present, and the future. Jordan Jameson.
Not much of a speaker, but done a lot of youth initiatives over the last 10 years or so, with a lot of fire people. So I want to talk a little bit about the firekeeping, but not too much. Strong suit is singing, so I'm going to sing a song, and that's going to be it. Using the fire for a lot of teachings, and you learn them over your entire lifetime. And for this conference, we're going to use it for to offer our prayers and just to bring peace to the conference and to have good come in with open mind and a kind spirit. And the song, we're going to do the same song we did at the fire because it's very important. And we are inviting the grandmothers and the grandfathers and also the Great Spirit to sit with us, to learn, and to teach us. Thank you.
Jordan Jameson.
And what ties us all together is our Anishinaabe Moen.
Chimiguach, Elder Sue. Okay, since Chief used up 15 minutes of my time, we're trying to keep on track here. What time is it? I don't know. We're good? It's 10:30. No, I can't say anything. But just a couple of, I just want to introduce Allison. Allison, can you stand up for a second? She is going to go to the sessions this morning. She'll be in the front row, but if you don't want any pictures taken or anything, just tell her to leave. She won't mind telling her to leave. You do have a package, so the sessions, it's first, so if you need to get to the session that you want, just grab your snack, go right to the sessions. The sessions are 2 times today, except for one of them will only run once. If you have any questions, either ask for me, Sherry, stand up. We have the LSK staff in the room. Can you stand up for a second or wave where you are? Study their faces. Because if you have any questions or if you want any networking, it would be good to get in contact with them. That's for any of the speakers today. They have their emails on here. If you like what you hear, contact them for future generation. Other than that, have a good day. We'll speak more. Oh, by the way, if the first person can say all this Ojibwe at the top here, I'll give you a prize. Miigwech. Never mind, you're not going anywhere.
She forgot the paddle.
The TRC, I'll let them introduce themselves, and Laura.
Bonjour. Flor Mertes Pass, Mrs. Alvin Donjois, Mission Canyon Dem. I'm going to let everybody get seated here. Go ahead, take a seat, guys. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the TRC Writers Panel. My name is Laura Mayer. I'm currently the Chinookan Galen Manager at Mississauga No. 8 First Nation. That means I do legal development, constitution work for the community. What happened is the Mississaugas, like Chief Reform was saying, have been doing some revitalization work in our nationhood, and so we've been starting to network and we've been starting to share resources. And so some of the people at the credit have been bringing me in for different events, and I've been happy to oblige because I love coming down here and I love working with people from the credit. They're my family. So I went to Nipissing University for my undergraduate, graduated in gender equality and social justice. I went to Osgoode Hall Law School for my Juris Doctor, and since then I've been working at my home community doing consultation and legal development. So when Veronica asked me, she said, well, what ideas do you have for this symposium on Indigenous education and curriculum? I said, well, I have lots of ideas and I have lots of opinions, but really the person you want to talk to is my husband, Brian. Some blatant nepotism here. So he's the smartest guy I know, so I'll let him introduce himself. But what I want to do is offer a little bit of context before we go into the panel, and then they'll let the educators speak and answer some questions. So just homework at the end. If you have a question, just raise your hand. I'll get you in there when we have time. If you don't want to actually ask it out in the open, you can just write it down and bring it down to me, and then I'll add it into the line of questions for these guys. So we all remember when the news broke in July that on social media that there was a sudden cancellation of the Ministry of Education's TRC summer writing team. And the people who first received this news are these folks right here, and as members of that team. So the previous government of Kathleen Wynne had committed in 2016 to update course content at the elementary and secondary levels, including social studies, history, geography, and civics, to teach all students about the legacy of residential schools as part of the TRC calls to actions numbers 62 and 63. And I believe they're in your package, so I'm not going to read them out. So since 2016, the summer writing teams had focused on the most direct changes and kind of the most critical changes in regards to history. So the grades 1 through 8 elementary, and then the grade 10 history course, which is the mandatory one in secondary school. So this work's been completed and it's now being in use across the province. You can go to the Ministry of Education's website and you can see the curriculum changes. In 2018, they were supposed to start social studies, grades 1 and 3, Canadian geography, civics and citizenship, grade 10, grade 12 geography, the environment and resource management, grade 12 history, grade 11 and 12 law, grade 12 family studies, grade 12 anthropology, sociology, and psychology. So these are the things that got canceled and these are the changes that haven't been implemented. And I think just by the list, we can all see how critical those changes would have been in the Ontario curriculum moving forward. So just a little bit about background. I am not as familiar with this as I should be, but there was a steering committee struck that indicated what the changes needed to be, what changes needed to happen in the curriculum, and they determined things like splitting up curriculum expectations or simply adding in Indigenous content, and they recommended outreach to curriculum writers and editors. So this panel is made up of writers who crafted the language for the curriculum, and that was going to be inserted or added. And then they worked intensive weeks together, and then they did some online work together to complete their documents. And then after the writers is an editor's stage, who go through and really kind of pick apart and make sure that only the very critical content is going in. I don't know how many of you guys are educators in the room. Can you raise your hand? Okay, so you guys know everything about curriculum. So I was kind of worried that it might be like a mixed group and people hadn't seen what a curriculum expectation looks like. So you guys know kind of how bland they look, but you love it. So the editors and the writers kind of bounce things back and forth until they come up with a complete document. So that's enough for some background at the moment. Remember, I'll let these guys introduce themselves, give a little bit of their background, a little bit of their motivation for being on the TRC writing panel, kind of why they were chosen, what were the critical things that they wanted to bring into the curriculum editing, and then we'll do some questions after that. So I'll send it off to my husband.
Brad Belfay, Nation Sing First Nation, this is Hockey number 8, Don't Talk. So I'm glad you had some good humor from her. Contrary to most people's beliefs, I did marry her for her humor. Although she is the most smartest woman I know. So I started out very young as a person. And then as I grew up, I learned more about the world. And my first-hand experiences, there's a wide variety of them. Some are at the hospital, some are at the police station, some are on the streets with ambulance drivers, and some are on the streets with police officers. And a lot of experiences I've had in schools as well. And so I met her at university. She didn't lie to you about that, that's true. And we worked together for many years before we even dated. And we knew we worked together well because we were working with Aboriginal youth at risk. And so as time went on, neither of us knew what she wanted to do. I had no idea what I wanted to do. I just knew I had to keep busy. And so in life, we had a kid, and then we had another kid. And then some days I don't get enough sleep. And time just flies by, but the truth is, when I look at my experiences in school, and I look at experiences of the children in school, I know that a great difference needs to be made. And so even though I work for Aboriginal Youth Services in Onoki, and I work in North Bay, and I write Gladue reports for a living, I am OCT, not OCD, sorry, OCT. And, but I was the writer, and a call out occurred, and my mother-in-law, so her mom, no nepotism there, sorry, told me about, hey look, there's this call out for curriculum writers. I know you never want to be a teacher, you want to teach college. Why don't you go do that? And I said, that's perfect, because I want to change the education system. That was my first step in. And so That's where I met these folks. And the reason I did it is because whenever I've had life experiences in schools and hospitals in the north and on the streets, we're always faced with public servants. We're always their workers. They're the people of the public that serve us and that we work together. And it was ignorant of who we are and what we are, and I faced negative experiences because of it. And just as Chief LaForme said, it's not enough to teach knowledge, we need to teach consciousness. He just said that. So I don't know if I can't quote a page or anything. He just said it, so it's an echo. That's my goal. When we edit this curriculum, yes, it's to help gather and strengthen the knowledge that First Nations Métis Inuit students in classrooms gain. It's also to educate every single student or child in this province so that 20 years from now, when they become public servants, doctors, nurses, lawyers, teachers, they'll have that much more knowledge about our Indigenous people and will treat us that much better when we come to services. Because that's the real truth when everything boils down to it. It's about our daily lives. So if we teach knowledge, teach consciousness, the lives of our children will improve so much more. So that's who I am, and that's motivation. There's more to who I am, but I won't reveal everything today.
Thank you.
Actually, I'll pass it on.
Hello, my name is Tammy Enemy, and I was 26 years a teacher in secondary in London, Ontario, and for the last year and a little bit, I've been the Indigenous Education Lead for the London District Catholic School Board. And why I'm here, I would say it's by accident, except for it almost seems like somebody or something bigger than me is why I'm here, and bigger than I can understand. As my friend Steve Paquette says, there's a reason that you're here. So what happened was I was helping to write an online Canadian history course with a team of people, and the ministry person who was on my team forwarded my name to the ministry, and she contacted me and said, hey, do you want to be part of this team? We're revising the grade 10 Canadian history curriculum, and we're adding Indigenous content. And I said, why do you want me for that? I don't have any special knowledge. I'm not worthy of doing that job. And she said, well, we don't need you for your knowledge of Indigenous history. We need you because you have a very intimate knowledge with the current curriculum, which is true. I've been spending years and years working on it. And I have this rule that I've always lived by, which is that if something comes along, you do it unless you can't. So I said yes, completely not understanding that I was literally going to blow up my whole life. So I went, and we sat at this table, and for the first time in my life, it was me and then maybe 3 non-Indigenous people, and everybody else was First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. And I'm not proud of how little I knew, because I've always been very proud of being a history teacher who's teaching students about finding truth and seeking out bias and all these things that I'm really proud of doing all those years. And I was just stunned by how little I knew. So I was like a vessel, and I was receiving this information from elders like Grace, who's sitting over there, and she's a residential school survivor. I'm not proud to say I learned about the 60 Scoop from a 60 Scoop survivor sitting at that table during that week. That's how little knowledge I had. So it was a complete transformation for me. And I went back to my classroom, and then I started teaching about it. And then when the job came up, I never, ever thought I'd leave the classroom. I'd been asked to do various things at various times in my life, and I said, oh, I'd never leave the classroom, I'd never leave the kids, I'm a teacher. But then this would not let go of me, and I was asking for advice from friends like Ryan and other friends, and just decided to take a chance, even though, again, like, least qualified person in the room always seemed to be the theme of my journey. I took it, and luckily I have an Indigenous cultural partner from the Oneida Nation of the Thames, and we work one-on-one on everything. And so we're hopefully making some big changes in London, Ontario, in our school board. and I'm on this amazing personal journey and trying to live out of the truth of reconciliation calls to action.
My name is Paul Meggs. I spent 17 years up in the north. After realizing I wanted to travel, and with my teaching degree, I got a position with CUSO over in Nigeria, and they kept on asking me about my country in America, and I realized I knew nothing about my country, really. It's hard to be the one person encyclopedia about Canada. They always thought I was American anyways. When I came back, I realized I wanted to continue working. As an educator in Nigeria, I saw firsthand the limitations of the colonial education system that it imposed on a colony, and realized that the real best work can be done on a community-based community education model. And so I'd already worked for Frontier College with community literacy work in inner city Toronto. I went back to Frontier College, and they said, well, check out the Baffin. And I went, oh, okay. And I got into the Baffin region, and I stayed for 17 years. But actually, I did a little bit of a trip with the Kanawagi Survival School, teaching grade 8 English for a couple months before I went up too. So that was an education. It was wonderful. So I was very blessed to work in curriculum development up there, because they were starting to, the Inuit were starting to take control of the programming. And you wear a lot of hats when you're working in an Indigenous community with not a lot of resources. So you basically are in charge of instruction as well as programming and program development all at the same time, because the books that you're left with are totally useless. You have to retool everything and find out where the kids are and all this. But there are a lot of resources in the community itself. So I thought cross-cultural education, that's the best for me. I grow a lot that way. As you can see, I'm middle-class white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male. I've had pretty good, and I too grew up young like women. But I just put myself in a minority situation to just grow. When I came south in 2004, I started working in the Ontario system, and a colleague of mine who was my special needs assistant in my class in APEX was not coordinator of Units of Inuit, which is an umbrella organization for the Inuit in Ontario. And when the calls to action came up, my wife Kathy and I were following this quite seriously, because Kathy was also an educator. While we're up north, we adopted two boys, traditionally have kept close ties with their extended family, which I still keep in touch with. So I'll get a little message that, nice and said Margaret Baffin this weekend. So I got to go back and see my old student who's now father and all the rest of it. So we keep in touch with that. I'm also raising, by the way, a grandson who just told me the other day, he said they laughed at my name. And naming in the Inuit tradition is naming is very special. When you take on the name of someone, you embody the spirit of that person. So when I took my son Levi, who was named after an elder in Clyde River, back to Clyde when he was about 7, for a trip that I was doing, he was surrounded by family members that he never knew, but they were calling him grandfather, even though they were older. The whole connection is very special. So I'm dealing with that face-to-face with Matt right now, saying, no, you got to be proud of your name. It's really what you named you after your great-grandfather, and you know the rest of it. So that's very dear to me. So when it was my colleague Christine who recommended me to Joanne, the lead, Jennifer, yeah. Oh my gosh. Anyway, they said, submit your resume to be. I said, damn right I will. This is really, really important work. But I was hoping there would be some more Inuit there. and Monica Itzadjawak as the only two people in the room that were speaking on behalf of the Inuit voice. Are there any Inuit in the room today? Okay, I rest my case. There's a real need for allies to be able to help that voice be heard. And so I guess that's the basic background. I'm just going to go into why I think this is so important, and I'll just plow through the points. I guess of all the tools for reconciliation, education makes the most sense, and it's the most important as far as I'm concerned. I just want the children to know that reconciliation is not a liberal ideology. That it's the only way that these unresolved issues can be faced with the full understanding of our history and our story. And it's help mold tolerant minds and understand the depth and nuances of this incredibly rich stories that we have. I guess it's the most logical platform I see to talk about identity, the self-loathing that comes about from colonialism, the fact that I guess personally to me when you talk about, I talk about the issues of suicide. Kathy and I lost on average a student a year when we were up there. And I personally, my first year was lost a student in my class. But it was Nathan and Dad that had to point out that Inuit don't do this because they're Inuit. And it has to do with the conditions that have been put upon them and the disenfranchisement. And I think it's the history curriculum that discusses these things. I think it makes our identity more complete. If kids grow up not having a sense of Canada as being these two founding nations mythology, then they're left with finding themselves being molded by an ideology which is fundamentally racist and exclusive. And I think you're talking about this stand-up comedy, help me with the name. It's on Netflix. 3,000 years of Latin history for fucking morons. You really should check it out. Because he says, if you don't see yourself represented outside yourself, you feel fucking invisible. So I guess it's a matter of making our identity complete, because that's primarily what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with a vast, diverse, rich segment of our country as it is now that feels invisible. And especially Inuit, because even in the context of writing of history of Canada, the North, the Arctic has been glossed over. Even Monica said, thank you for bringing me here, but I keep thinking that the Inuit is more of an afterthought. And they come by that honestly. We all said, no, Monica, you're not going to be an afterthought. It's going to be included. So the language includes not First Nations, Métis, or Inuit community will be, it's a and now. So that little bit there is really fucking amazing. So I guess the last two reasons I think it's so important. One is just, I guess it goes back to what I said, it's a compassionate reason. Founding just compassion. And I guess it's a political responsibility that a government has to take on and make sure that they, as a democratic institution, speak for all those people, especially those who can't speak for themselves, like the children, and children in need, and people of transgender, and First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And that's the political responsibility that I think. So that's my story in a nutshell.
Okay, so this is my last question, but I'm going to make it my first question. It's a little bit loaded. The first thing that I thought of when I was in the room when Brian got the email for canceling the curriculum, the writing team, he was actually, I think he was washing and doing laundry, and packing, because it was a Friday afternoon, afternoon, and he was supposed to be there Monday morning. So he was gonna be leaving on Sunday, so he was, they were ready. There were people who were actually already there and getting ready to be doing this work. So it's important to note the kind of suddenness at which this came about. So my loaded question is, one of the responses that I found was that people said, okay, well here's all these resources, all you teachers, now you have a personal responsibility to carry on this work in your classrooms individually. And here's all these resources that you can use in your classroom. And so my loaded question is, can teachers continue to follow the calls to action without the changes to the curriculum? And do you think that's an effective approach? And I'm not passing on.
So the question, can teachers do it? Well, yes. The first teacher I seen with that fire right in their heart was Tammy. And because Tammy was just sitting there, and she was just, she cried, she was angry, she was regretful, but she was my seat buddy, so she was having this train ride while we were doing this together, this beautiful journey. And she's like, I'm a teacher. I'm going to go back and do this. And so we met in 2 different periods. The first period, we chatted, we all talked, we all worked hard together. And the second time, and that first time we met, it's something I learned because when I went to teachers college, no one ever talked about Indigenous people at all. Never. In fact, one of the professors went, oh, well, John Long will talk to you about it, Dr. John Long. He retired 3 years ago. I tell the professor, he's not here anymore. And she went, well, who's going to talk to you about Indigenous people? And I said, I'm a student and to be at the program. I don't know, isn't that your job? So that buck was passed on for so long that, John Long, but even now, they're still trying to pass the buck, and that great man isn't even alive. And it's like, holy, come on, you guys gotta step up. And so coming from that teacher's program, when I seen Tammy, that was afterwards, and I go do Ledoux writing work, and I'm still doing it, and I go to curriculum writing, and I'm sitting there with Tammy the first time, and I said, something these teachers weren't ready for in the program. I said, did you know there's an Indigenous student in every classroom in the country? Every classroom has one. She was like, now hold on now, I've been teaching for 26 years. Well, back then it wasn't 26, but it is now, or was, maybe 24. And she was like, okay. So the second time we met, not even a hi, hello, how have you been, how's your family? She just comes running up to me, you were right. And I was like, I don't even know what you're talking about. I just said that one time. I don't even think I was done my coffee yet. And I told her, did you just in every class? And she just came, she said, you're right. I was going to class, and there was at least 1, 2 students, 3 students every class. Yeah, we're not Indigenous. She was just, so she said, I've been working hard ever since. She stole everything I could give her. She milked me real good. Then she went to the next person. She shut. So can teachers do it? Yes, they can. She did it. And then she called me afterwards and she said, there's this Indigenous speech job. And I said, don't take it. I told her, she's laughing. I go, don't you take it. I said, we need you in there. We need you teaching those kids and slapping them around. We need this knowledge. We need this history taught. Because can teachers do it? Yes. But how many do it? How many white teachers really do this hard work? Tammy. And so now that she's the lead, she gets to go around the school board. She's got the teachers. She goes, here's the content. So I'm so happy that she ignored me. She came to me for advice. Brian, I really want your opinion. I really value it. I said, don't take it. No way. And she's like, I'm going to ignore his opinion that I got. And she did it. Because she knew, wow, he'll see. I'll be really valuable. And she is. And that's why today, she's here. Because she's here to find, hey, go to white teachers. You watch. She's going to come around. She's going to get you. And you're going to be in there and go, I thought I already knew stuff. No, I know more. And it's going to be, so can they do it? Yes. And in that board, they can do it even better. And I want one of her in every board. So if anyone knows how to genetically clone Tammy, not sleeping. So that, can they do it? And are they doing it? It's harder to do it, especially in this urban setting. We have Tammy who does.
was using reverse psychology on me when he said not to do it. Yes, do it. So I'll tell you a little story to say, same answer, yes, they can do it. There was, right around Orange Shirt Day, Ray, my partner from the Oneida, and I were in a kindergarten classroom, and he was doing storytelling, and I read a storybook, and then he was asking the kids to find similarities and differences in the book, and we had this nice little time, and then when it was over, this little girl, this really irrepressibly bright little kindergarten girl who had to answer every single question, she put up her hand and she said to Ray, how did you feel when those people came and took you away from your mommy and daddy and brought you to the bad school? So Ray explained that his father went to residential school, but he didn't go to residential school, and I was just kind of stunned by this kindergarten could absorb this lesson. And by the way, kindergarten has not been revised, so that is not something that was necessarily something that the teacher had to do. But then the very next day, I was having a lunch. We had this thing with all of our secondary students called Confederacy Councils. Each secondary school, there's 9 of them, has a Confederacy Council of Indigenous students in it. And then when we meet together with the Grand Confederacy Council, and we do it, it's all modeled on the Haudenosaunee model because Ray is Haudenosaunee. And we invited an Indigenous education advisor from Fanshawe to come and join us that day. That's a college in London, and he didn't make it. And then he emailed me later and he said he was so sorry he didn't make it, but they had a really upsetting day because at their Orange Shirt Day display at Fanshawe, the kids who were like running the booth were getting blank stares or disrespect, and the kids in the school weren't understanding anything about Orange Shirt Day. So it occurred to me that we're like, there's the parameters of where we're at. We've got this kindergarten kid who knows, and the kids who are currently in college, they wouldn't know yet. They haven't had this knowledge yet. But you know what? That kindergarten girl will definitely have that knowledge when she hits college. So it absolutely can be done, and I'm not having 100% success with the teachers, but I'm having a lot of success with the teachers. And Ray is having a lot of success with the teachers, and I'm so grateful to the leadership of my board who is really, really committed. We made our very first PD day a focus on truth and reconciliation, and we had a knowledge keeper at all 9 of our high schools speaking to not just high schools, but the family schools that went with those high schools. And then those people in the audiences, they were just like me, like I was in 2016. They would just move forward into a place of greater understanding. And the director of my board was so blown away by the results of that day that next year we're going to, for the first time in about 10 years, we're bringing together the entire system at one location, and we're going to have a guest speaker to speak about truth and reconciliation. We're hoping for the person who runs the Human Rights Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg, I think it's called, and we want him to talk about truth and reconciliation. So absolutely it can be done, and I was so angry about the curriculum being, I'm going to say postponed, not canceled. But Ray said to me, Tammy, that doesn't change what we're doing. And I still want the rest of the curriculum revised, but we are moving forward for sure.
I guess the context of the last 2 statements are framed around the fact that there are certain boards that take it upon themselves to have an Indigenous rep, right? Others don't. So if it were mandated and taken seriously, then I think more motion, there would be more movement in that area. I was very blessed to be in the Durham board. I was taught next to Aaron Elmhurst, who's the Indigenous rep there, and they went around looking for Indigenous reps in all the schools, and they would bring them in. So there was funding available for us to come and meet and speak with knowledge keepers and things like that, and also bring in and try. And so my job as the person who took it upon himself to say, okay, what would Inuit voice? I would seek out resources and speakers, Inuit and Shiva Babatsi, an old student from who was taught by my wife when she taught me in Bangalore, was living in Oshawa. Okay, you just have to keep looking, and social media is really helpful for that. So I got Sheep into the classroom, and she gave, and I co-facilitated. I never done a workshop before. And I stood back, and she did the whole day, a whole morning session, a whole afternoon session, took on every classroom from grade 4 to 8 in that school. She did really well, and she just blew them wide open. She said they'd never met an Inuk before without realizing it, right? And so it's been having a network. If you can find a network and keep it going and growing, that's where things will move forward. Teachers also kind of, they don't want to work too hard when it comes to programming. They don't have a lot of time. All right, so if I'm a teacher in a classroom and I have a new curriculum in front of me that says I have to find information on Inuit community from the 1400s, well, where do I go? What is the story? And I realized after working with these guys, there's an awful lot. The Inuit is the largest indigenous group of distribution in the world, from eastern Greenland to Alaska. And that little fact is known enough of itself to say, hey, that's pretty special. You should know about these people that have been up there for thousands of years, and how and the waves of migration routes and their language patterns and all the rest of it. It's really amazing stuff. And what was their relationship with the crown? And how is it different? And what is, and just reading up on the first major land claim settlement was with northern Quebec, and they were forced by the Quebec Supreme Court to take that deal. They were totally, it would not happen today in the same way. So there's the whole story itself, I guess, is tying into where are those resources. So I put my energies into trying to gather something that's really, really user-friendly. So I've been working on a timeline of Inuit history from 30,000 BC to 2019, and I've got it on a document that on a Google Doc that I can share with you. But it's certainly not complete, and I'm trying to put it onto a website with a blog so that knowledge keepers can keep sort of feeding the information into it. So that's I can't do that all by myself, obviously. So I'm hoping I'll get tied in with the TI, Junasugan and Inuit, in Ottawa, where I live now, to say, okay, what can we do to get these resources available so that teachers can say, well, what do I do? Oh, we'll go to, I'll know about this resource, and that I can just go into the general inquiry from there. But again, it's also, the movement seems to come from those people that have a real intimate connection with the Indigenous community, like myself and a colleague of mine who's Métis from the last school I was at. The two of us took on most of the work to try and apply for funding through the board, through ministry, to get elders and knowledge youth come in to have money to have workshops. It was through extra funding, through the equity programming at DDSB that they asked me to come in and tell the Inuit story, where I laid out, and I found the money from the board, that they had a parcel of money that they applied for. So if you don't have a voice at the board trying to get that money from the ministry, then again, it's a roadblock. We got a polar projection. Oh, that's amazing. It's a polar projection of Canada, and I had it printed out 15 feet by 15 feet, and the kids walk on it, and they look like you're hovering above, and they're looking south. I purposely put the map on the floor, and they're looking south. They're standing on the North Pole, looking south, and we got little models of Viking ships and little schools and hostels and day schools and mission houses and the Dew-Line site, and boom, it's all there. So it's a matter of just trying to develop those kits so that it's out there. Anyway, so again, sorry, I just reiterated, it's money, advocates, and easy to use resources. So yeah, it can be done. Things like those parameters.
Okay, thanks, Paul.
Sorry.
No, perfect. We have a question up here. I'll just ask you to speak loud, and I'll repeat your question.
Excellent. My name is Jeanette. I'm
problems that happen is that it's usually Indigenous people doing the advocating, right? We're the ones kind of screaming into the wind, trying to move things forward. But the actions that you're talking about mobilizing online, and maybe it's teachers too, right? You guys are hungry for this knowledge. You're hungry to implement it in the classroom, and maybe it's teachers' college. Do you guys have we have a professional, oversight board? Maybe it's advocating within your own professional oversight board and figuring out that. But I think Mississaugas is a credit, and I'm from Mississauga number 8. I cannot speak for Mississaugas as a credit, just FYI. But they already are working and advocating very, very hard to continue to push forward education for Indigenous content and curriculum. And I think this is part of it. And this was part of them trying to make sure it stays on the forefront. So thank you, Veronica, for making sure that it's still something very up there and really hard for us to talk about. So I will actually let the teachers and educators answer this question.
I like my answer that I would like to say was what you stated in your question. Pressure on the school boards is huge. If we can get the boards as advocates, that's what we need. Because I'm a writer, and I wrote for the history curriculum, but I work for Aboriginal Legal Services, so I have quite a bit of knowledge of law. And law was part of the phase 2 on writing. And because I was really good friends with Jennifer when we were there, she told me what phase 3 was too. Phase 3 was those other courses like math, where you don't think Indigenous content would be a part of it. I think that, and I have a math degree actually. And so I was also going to move over to phase 3. So for me, it wasn't just the fact that it got canceled, but it's the fact that everything I aspired to, I worked for, and I've lived for, got canceled, and that I knew what was coming up got canceled. All of my lifelong work to change the next generation of people got canceled. How do we action? School boards, get the local boards on board. A lot of them are on board. North Bay, both the Catholic and the public board, English boards in North Bay are very, very, very good advocates. They've been doing a lot of local work, so we actually have in every school an Anishinaabe teacher. And in fact, we've had so many postings that we ran out of language teachers, even though there's actually quite a few my age. I count about 7. And they're all employed in the boards, but they're still open jobs. And so these boards have been our greatest allies in North Bay, in Oklahoma. They will advocate. So wherever you're from, hopefully there's some people other than Eastern Ontario here, we can go and pressure the boards to make the greatest difference. First Nations education directors can write letters. I know immediately I wrote a letter, and I put it on Facebook, and I encourage other people to write a letter. That was my personal experience. Either parents was that.
I can certainly bring a resolution before my Indigenous Education Committee at my school board, and I can ask my public counterpart, and we work together. I can do that at my level. I would look at my phone right now and check it, but it would look really rude. But there's a hashtag out there already called hashtag Teachers for TRC, I believe it's called. I'd have to check, I'm not sure. The other thing that I always wonder about, the TRC calls to action, that's across Canada. So I often wonder what kind of a role the federal government could have in pressuring the provincial governments. I don't know the answer to that question.
I thought you answered your question in the question. That was brilliant, because I came here thinking, what can we do? How do you talk about compassion to a government that just boils everything down to a fiscal responsibility? I just don't know. I don't think there's a common thread there. So we have to speak in terms of votes. And if we had a petition from a bunch of teachers, we're all overpaid, we get our summers off. I don't think they take us very seriously. So, and there hasn't been the warmest, cuddly environment towards educators generally for a long time. And it's, so if we can get petitions, I think it would be great to be more all embracing that. If EFO and OSSTF could combine a petition and get parents on something to move us forward, and it has to be done. Justice Sinclair was quoted on CBC saying the truth will set you free, but it'll piss you off when you first did it. And I think there has to be more anger, and we have to not be afraid of anger. And we can be angry without losing it, you know. And if we can have some sort of way of phrasing it in such a way that they don't get their back up, but understand that, oh, wait a second, we're a responsible government. We're here for not just a little guy. We're here for everybody. If they have to, if they're going to be in that position and use everything on the grounds of it's being fiscally responsible, then we might have to counter by saying maybe it's more fiscally responsible to educate the youth to be more up to date with the truth as it is and how to move forward in a more productive way. So it's the language that I would personally wrestle with. If you put me in a room with some of these guys, I don't think I'd be the best person to be there. I know some people out there that would be brilliant in it, but so that's just my 2 cents. But I think a petition is the way to go. So we should maybe figure a way of drafting it up today. Awesome. I feel good about that.
Forgive my ignorance, because I really am ignorant about what power the school boards have, but if there was, and it sounds like things were really close to actually putting pen to paper and writing up curriculum, and there seems to be some sort of thought that this government is not going to be receptive, and if you put pressure on the school boards, could the school board simply say, I'm going to get together the people who were about to come together and start writing this curriculum, and start writing it and say, to heck with the provincial government?
So the question was,
That might be incredibly naive.
yeah, so the question was whether the school boards could sponsor to continue on the work of the TRC writing teams.
No, don't.
I think that's a Ministry of Education. Oh, maybe I have answers for here.
Hi, my name is John Ingram. I'm a superintendent with the Corbin Pine Ridge District School Board. First of all, the answer to your question is we have mandated curriculum that are expressed through the expectations. They are ministry documents and they are policy. They need to be followed. So certainly school boards can do their own work in enhancing that curriculum. However, the standard curriculum expectations need to be covered. What I would suggest to everyone in the room, though, and we've been working on this at our school board, is before we move to the next set of revisions, we currently have revisions from grade 4 to 8 in history and social studies, and grade 10 history courses. We've done significant preparation for those, but we're not really sure that they're going to be dealt with in a really good way in the classroom. And so what we're working really hard on in our board is to work with every teacher in the system individually to make sure that the ones that are actually on the books right now get done in the best way possible. Just because you write curriculum expectations into documents, it doesn't mean they're going to be done, or it doesn't mean they're going to be done well. So while we're fighting for the next round of revisions, I think we all need to take some personal responsibility and make sure that the ones that are actually on the books now are done the way they should be done and not just ignored. Because we found in our work that teachers were really nervous when we brought them together and talked to them about these revisions. So again, we can all come to a session like this, and we had sessions like this with our teachers, but when they go back to the classroom, they have to be done in a good way. And that's what we're really focusing on right now. And I would urge all of us to think about that and even provide a bit of a focus on the ones that we have now.
Hey, Bob. So, if I may, I got a little bit of an answer for that, and he quite well articulated the question. If school boards were to focus on editing curriculum, well, you still got the same thing that the current government is crying about, where there wasn't proper consultation. So that's what they'll say if we try and make our own minutes. School boards are to focus on supporting their teachers, and that's what he's speaking about. So if there was going to be a strong focus on a particular ground level thing, would say supporting the teachers so much for that. That is exactly what I would love to do, and I am seeing. But I like the truth that you say about the hesitation and the weariness of teachers when they walk into seeing the new curriculum, because there was quite substantial changes. And I actually got invited to speak about this in the Sudbury Catholic Court. And the reason is because I told this joke, and I'm afraid it was framed so well the first time I'll never be able to repeat it. But there's a lot of teachers with hesitation about getting this Indigenous history curriculum right and to properly deliver the content in the classroom. But as someone who's endured math and loved math all my life, when I go look at the current provincial success of students in mathematics, well, I see an awful lot of teachers teaching math and an awful lot of students with success in math. So as much as teachers are hesitant to talk about history, I on a personal level wish they were also hesitant to talk about math. So maybe but when it comes to that math, there's no Pythagoreans coming and, hey, I'm the local Pythagorean for institution. So there's that. So I agree wholly that there is a hesitation, and I have my own opinions on what we should do for math, but I won't get into that because I could go all day. So I'll just go all day on Indigenous. So yes, there is hesitation, and it's rightfully there because this is content that can be scary for some people who have to teach it, and they believe they may have never had an Indigenous student in a classroom when they have had one every single year they taught, and maybe they have never stepped on a First Nations territory or an Métis or Indian territory. And so,
But they're always on first.
oh yeah, they're always on. Yeah, but so that hesitation, I welcome, because that hesitation shows that there's a level of caring and a level of concern. So I considered that as Chief LaForme said, we want a conscience. We want people, raise people knowledge about conscience. But when you have teachers that are hesitant, as Tammy said, I'm underqualified in everything I do. Well, that's hesitation. That means there's conscience. That means she's willing to work harder. So those teachers that are hesitant, I welcome that because that shows they're conscious of what they're trying to do, whereas the teachers that aren't hesitant about math. Is another thing. You got it.
Go ahead.
If you
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Is that on? On or off? Doesn't matter. I'm the president of the Ontario Teachers Federation, and I have to say that, school boards are just one prong in the way that we get things done. Don't underestimate the work and the advocacy of our federations. The Ontario Teachers Federation is the official voice of all four of the affiliates, and the affiliates have been working really hard with the ministry to make sure that this is done. It has to be done. And waiting for perfection and waiting for additional money is not going to address the solutions and move us forward as a society. Now, I have had word that the minister has committed to coming back to us by the end of the month about what's going to happen in terms of the writing team. Of course, you never know wherein truth lies sometimes when you are speaking with the current regime. They do say they have been in talks with the chiefs of Ontario and that they are doing good work in this area, and so we just keep pushing. Saying and doing is two different things, and action is the important part of the cause. It is not
just like kind of a final thought, maybe end it on a high note, you know, since we're kind of doing limit. So I'll let you go with that.
So a final comment for me is feel free to approach us. We have spent all our lives advocating for education, educating people. So as many of you have. So if we're eating and you come up to us, we will gladly stop eating to talk. So we're going to be here all day. I'm going to be here all night even. Like, what will we eat? And I got, yeah, but I'll be here for a while. My final comment is it's a multi-pronged approach. So I do long future work. So this curriculum editing is work for the future. For me, it's for the future generation of public servants that will be made from the current kids in JKSK and the kids after them. The Benoji Sononic, oh no, Sononic means before them. Benoji after them, I don't know what after means. But that's what my writing is. Then there's the now, and that's the local actions in your current schools. I am paid to write Gladue reports, but I am still in the local elementary school once a week for free, volunteering my time. I speak on Skype, Northern Lights up on the James Bay coast. I do that front action work on my own time because that's the now. And same thing with Gladue reports, that's working with Indigenous people in the now. So I need both to balance my life. And I think doing both, advocating to your boards, that was a beautiful question right off the bat because we were talking about the now. And that's what these two people do. They do the now because that's what they are able to do in the moment. And we're sad that we lost our future work, but through advocation and the Ontario Teachers Federation, we will hashtag teachers for TRC, and we will make the future happen. You got it.
I just want to say that one thing I'm really noticing and feeling in the room is positivity and energy. For me, I had to make peace with the fact that I was not an Indigenous person in an Indigenous education lead role. It took me a while, but eventually what I realized was that Ray and I make the perfect team because I don't try to do culture. I don't try to pretend I have the knowledge. I have him for that. But what I do have is a very long experience with the school board. We went into one school and 5 of the teachers there were former students of mine. So I know the teachers. I certainly know all the secondary teachers. And so I have that and knowing my way around the board. And I appreciate the feeling in the room that it's okay to work in allyship. And you know, I hope that will continue because we need to do it together. Thanks.
It was the social studies 4 to 8 and the history kind of really focused on most of all. And I thought those were incredibly important documents because that's what all the kids have to take. And after grade 9 or 10, they can just not take any history courses and whatever. So I thought those are really important. So I guess I remember saying, wow, now that they're saying a student must study First Nations, Métis, and Inuit community and blah, blah, blah. Teachers are going to be like, oh my gosh, where am I going to get this information? So that's just what I said earlier. My calling now is to just network with as many educators as I can. And you have my email, and I'll share with you what I've been trying to work with and just network. I think that if you make something new good, it will be used. And my whole, the way I'm trying to live my life is trying to make things easier for people. You know, just make it easy. And so, not lazy, but easy. And that's what I think. There's an awful lot of momentum that is still because of the hunger for that knowledge. Now that they've been told they have to teach it, they have to find it. It's out there. It's incredibly rich. It's incredibly diverse, and it just makes us all much like something collectively with really good rigor, it'll be used. So, yeah, that's what I have to say. Thank you. Nakomi, Koyanami, Tumusubitsi, you're welcome. But some of the, Udlakot, good day. And another one would be Takula Rivugut. I will see you again.
So on that note, you have your marching orders. I'd like to thank the panelists, and we're going to move on to the next speaker.
Okay, we're gonna move on to the next session. I'm going to introduce Mark LaForme. He's from the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and he'll speak from the podium, and he'll introduce Honorable Justice Harry LaForme. Be watching.
Thank you, Vicki. Vicki, what do I do with this phone rings? Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the symposium on Indigenous education. It's my absolute honor and privilege to introduce your next speaker to give the keynote address this morning, Mr. Justice Harry LaForme. Justice Harry LaForme is a Mississauga Indian and a member of the Mississaugas of New Credit First Nation, located in southern Ontario. He was born and raised on his reserve, where some of his family continue to reside. Harry graduated from Osgoode Hall Law School in Toronto in 1977. He was called to the bar in 1979 and joined the law firm Osler, Hoskin & Harcourt's corporate commercial law practice. I bet that was fun, Harry. Harry soon left Osler's to start his own practice focusing on Aboriginal legal matters. In doing so, he litigated and was known for constitutional law and Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. He appeared before all levels of court and represented Aboriginal interests throughout Canada and abroad, including in Geneva, Switzerland, New Zealand, and the British Parliament. Harry was appointed Commissioner of the Indian Commission of Ontario in 1989, and then Chief Commissioner of the Federal Indian Claims Commission from 1992 to 1994. From October 1989 to June 1990, Justice LaForme also chaired the Independent National Chiefs Task Force on Native Land Claims. Harry taught at Osgoode Hall Law School in 1992 and 1993. In 1994, he was appointed to serve as a judge on what is now known as the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. Justice LaForme was then appointed to the Ontario Court of Appeal in 2004 and became the first Aboriginal person ever to sit on any appellate court in Canada, and I do believe in the Commonwealth. He briefly left the Court of Appeal to serve as the first chair of the Indian Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission regarding Aboriginal peoples. In 2008, he returned to the Court of Appeal for Ontario, where he worked as a judge until he retired. First Nations people across the country have recognized his accomplishments with honors such as the 1997 National Aboriginal Achievement Award in the area of law and justice, and by presenting him with at least 6 eagle feathers, which symbolize the virtues of honesty, integrity, and respect. First Nation elders bestowed this honor on Harry again when he was sworn in as an appellate court judge. In 2007, a first-year law student bursary was established in his name at the University of Windsor. Justice Laforme was an Olympic torch carrier for the 2010 Canada Winter Olympic Games. I didn't know that. In 2013, Justice Laforme was awarded an honorary doctorate in education at Nipissing University. In 2017, Justice Laforme was awarded an honorary doctorate of laws by the Law Society of Upper Canada in its call to the bar ceremony in Toronto. After 14 years of distinguished service, Justice Laforme retired from the Ontario Court of Appeal in October 2018. Harry recently joined the law firm Olthius, Clear & Townsend as their senior legal counsel. So at this time, please join me in welcoming Harry Laforme, retired Justice of the Ontario Court of Appeal.
Thank you, Mark. I thought you knew everything. How did you not know I carried the torch through our own territory? And what a pleasure it is to be asked to speak at an event on Mississauga territory in a school called Mississauga by my own home First Nation, which is the Mississaugas of New Credit. Doesn't get any better than that, I can tell you. It's a delight. It's an honor. And I just love the fact that this room is so packed with people that care about this issue of education. And there's so much to it and so many layers to it. I just hope that something can come from it. Before I start, though, I want to explain that I approach this symposium as being about teaching and learning of all Canadians, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. The teaching is of the true shared history of Canada and the beauty, culture, and history of its first inhabitants. We who have lived here for thousands of years before first contact and colonization. The disastrous provision of the colonial government of the education to Indigenous people is not the approach being taken to this symposium. In other words, I'm not here to talk about how the government of Canada has failed in its education of us. I don't care if it's the 3 R's or, I guess, our reading arithmetic for the math. In its 2015 calls to action, the Indian Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission asked Canadians to do the following. These are recommendations or calls to action. 62. We called upon the federal, provincial, territorial governments in consultation and collaboration with survivors, Aboriginal peoples, and educators. You can tell it's a kind of an old report because it uses the term Aboriginal, which I like actually. I prefer Aboriginal, or I even like Indian, and Mark referred to me as an Indian. It's probably because of my age, but Indigenous is a problem for me because rocks and trees are indigenous to territories as well, and I think we're a little different than that. In any case, that's the term that's now used, and that's the term in vogue, and that seems to be the term that apparently people like. So I'll accept that. And it said make age-appropriate curriculum in residential schools, treaties, and Aboriginal peoples, all mandatory. And they called about it. The education would go from kindergarten on through to grade 12. And I, like the previous speaker, think it goes beyond grade 12. I often say in law school, for example, that every law course needs to have an indigenous component taught in it, because the minute you inject an indigenous person, specifically an Indian Act indigenous person, a Section 35 Aboriginal rights person, and their territory into the mix, it completely changes everything. And I don't care what the subject is, it changes everything. And it should be taught there, it's not. There's also Call to Action 63, where it calls upon the Council of Ministers of Education Canada to maintain an annual commitment to Aboriginal education issues, and it goes on to spell some of those out. Now, some may wonder, why are these calls to action so imperative? I know generally you get a sense that they are, and you accept that there's a history, or there's a piece of history there that you didn't learn about. But it's more than that. First, it's because the true history of the settlement and creation of Canada is largely unknown. And that's by the vast majority of Canadians. Canadians do not know how or why the Indigenous Canadian relationship, for example, that we'll constantly talk about, reconciliation, why it's broken, why it's a broken mess. You don't really know that. You sense, you know, you have an idea that it is. And some of you may even think it's broken because treaties weren't honored. And it may be as simple as that, but trust me, it's way more than that. Second, it's because we are in the promised era of reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and Canada. Therefore, these calls to action become fundamental to that goal. You need to know how something, whatever it was, got broken, so we can, as a country, accurately fix it. So let me first very briefly describe what reconciliation means on a somewhat macro level. On June 11th, 2008, the then Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, apologized to former students of Indian residential schools, acknowledged, and in my view, the apology contains a very powerful promise. And I'm going to repeat some of the apology. The burden, can I just say something? This apology, by the way, in 2008, is a fundamental moment in our history. A couple of years ago, while I was a judge, we had what they call Open Door in downtown Toronto, and all the historic buildings and all of that are open to the public. And a group of high school students came in. I'm thinking this is 2010, 2011, something like that. And these high school students, 13, 14 years old, there was about 8 of them. And I have the apology on my wall, framed on my wall, because I think it is a momentous event for the apology. Maybe not necessarily for who gave it, but nevertheless, it's an apology. It's on behalf of Canadians in Canada. And I asked these students, I pointed up, because I have all kinds of Indian artifacts in my chambers, because I like to surround myself with who I am and where I come from, and I hope I don't ever want to forget that or make light of it or let it be in the back part of my life. It's front and center. So I have all these things, and I pointed out the apology to the students, and I said, there it is, there's the apology for the residential schools. And they give me this blank look. What is that? What are residential schools? College kids, 3 years after the apology and after the release of the report. Nevertheless, this is what the Prime Minister said. The burden of this experience has been on your shoulders for far too long. Ours. The burden is properly ours as a government and as a country. There is no place in Canada for the attitudes that inspired the Indian residential school system to ever prevail again. You have been working on recovering from this experience for a long time in a very real sense. We are now joining you on this journey. A cornerstone of the settlement agreement is the Indian Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This commission presents a unique opportunity to educate all Canadians on the Indian residential school system. It will be a positive step in forging a new relationship between Aboriginal peoples and other Canadians, a relationship based on the knowledge of our shared history, a respect for each other, and a desire to move forward together with a renewed understanding that strong families, strong communities, and vibrant cultures and traditions will contribute to a stronger Canada for all of us. In April 2016, during an emergency debate in the House of Commons, triggered by a suicide crisis in a small fly-in First Nation community in Northern Ontario, Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould spoke about the unfinished business of Confederation. The unfinished business, according to her, includes the deconstruction of the colonial legacy of Confederation. She noted that it is not easy to remove the shackles of 140 years of its life under the Indian Act. Our government is committed to ensuring, in partnership with Indigenous peoples, to do just that. The Justice Minister sees the unfinished business of Confederation as including the creation of a new relationship that guarantees Aboriginal rights and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This new relationship the Prime Minister has tasked their government with creating, she describes as being, quote, to work with Indigenous peoples to establish nation-to-nation relationship that is based on recognition. A relationship based on recognition is transformative. It is a relationship based on respect, cooperation, and partnership. So, the beginning for true reconciliation, as I hear it, is education. Knowledge of our shared history and the deconstruction of the colonial legacy. The deconstruction of the colonial regime. To understand decolonization and how to create this new nation-to-nation relationship, we need to learn. We need to be taught. We need to be educated. This includes indigenizing education. And I'll say more about this in a moment. It has been noted that the need to decolonize includes the indigenization of education. This stems from shared experiences of colonialism across the globe. In a world divided by ongoing conflict and fueled by issues of power and control, the need to closely examine the ways that education has served dominating interests, it is said, will help to inform future education initiatives, as well as serve as a form of reparation for those Indigenous peoples who have endured the dire consequences of colonialism. Present-day efforts, such as they may be, to reclaim, restore, and revitalize threatened traditions are supported by international bodies such as the United Nations, in tandem with a range of approaches at national levels. There can be no doubt that this is true in the minds of most Canadians, however, and obviously not all. Nevertheless, and let there be no doubt, that decolonization in order to achieve reconciliation includes the indigenization of education. The Liberal government under Kathleen Wynne, as you know, promised in 2016 that Ontario schools would teach all students about the legacy of residential schools and incorporate Indigenous perspectives into the provincial curriculum. Indigenous educators and elders, some of you are here, were to travel to Toronto in early July 2018 to participate in writing of the curriculum revision project over a period of 2 weeks. However, on the Friday afternoon, just prior to commencement of the writing project, team members received emails telling them the plan was canceled. The Mississauga's New Credit First Nation Council initiated this event in response to the Ontario provincial government's cancellation of the writing sessions. Specifically, this symposium is to discuss the importance of Indigenous education in Ontario classrooms. Among other things, I interpret this to at least mean teaching and hearing about two separate and distinct areas of importance. First, there is the history and role that Indigenous people played in the evolution of this country we today call Canada. And while Kathleen Wynne's government was certainly correct about the need to teach about the legacy of residential schools, respectfully, that falls far short of the mark. And I suggest that in the June 2008 apology recognized that a broader form of education was needed. It's knowledge of our shared history, of which the legacy of the Indian residential schools is merely a part. Second, there is our history, our story, the Indigenous story. That includes our history, customs, beliefs, traditions, and methods of living within the civil societies we had created long before first contact. Both need to be the subject of Indigenous education in Ontario classrooms if there is ever to be true reconciliation, as everyone seems to think we're on the road to. This then is what I mean when I say indigenize education. I'm not the most qualified person to speak about the second area I talked about, our story. There are many speakers here today whose knowledge and teachings in this regard are far more informed than mine and whose voices should be heard. Accordingly, I intend to comment on the first area, the teaching and learning about the place of Indigenous people in Canada and how we got to the disastrous place we are today. In other words, teaching and learning about colonization and the need to tear it down. Now, I've commented on this many times and in many forums, and the one thing I've learned throughout the years that I've commented about this is that it's never enough. You can't talk about this enough. It needs to be said over and over again because unless you understand it, you don't understand the problem. About 600 years ago, colonists of North America and the nations of Indigenous people of what is now Canada began a relationship based on equality, fair exchange, mutual respect for the dignity and integrity of the other. And as you may know, the relationship was documented and affirmed in treaties. And some of these were as early as 1613 and wampum belts. Indeed, treaties were the primary means of maintaining diplomatic relations between the Indigenous people and colonizing nations. Fair exchange and mutual benefit were core principles of treaty making. They were made for various purposes: peace, trade, alliance, neutrality, and military support. As settlement grew, they were a way of maintaining relationships in an era of increased contact between Indigenous peoples and the settlers to maintain peace and acquire access to Indigenous lands and resources. In 1709, a British naturalist and explorer described the Indigenous people as being sincerely honest, people who kept their promises and did not cheat or hurt others. They willingly gave shelter to others and were useful and loyal to their guests. In fact, his view was, and I quote from the document, "They are really better to us than we are to them." But wasn't he prescient? John Malloy, in his writings notes the early appreciation by colonist government. In 1836, he says, the Upper Canadian Attorney General, R. Jameson, gave evidence of the continuation of that constitutional norm. First Nations, he wrote, have written within their own communities, governed themselves by their own laws and customs. In short, First Nations were self-governing within their recognized jurisdictions, including all internal affairs. During this time, dominance over North American territory was a paramount concern of the various nations wishing to settle it. The view of the newcomers was that Indigenous nations in eastern North America were attractive allies in the contest to colonize the continent. Indigenous nations wanting to defend their lands from American expansion allied with the British colonists. Central to this alliance was the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which was issued to quell unrest amongst the nations by forbidding settlement on Indian land and regulating trade. It also created a permanent regime concerning Indigenous lands, the system of land surrenders and treaties. I would add to the 1763, why that Royal Proclamation became so important was there was unrest taking place around the Great Lakes, and Chief Pontiac and his allies thought that the British Crown was taking too much control over the territory and insisting on their forms of government and infringing on the First Nations. And so they began an uprising at that period of time. And in order to quell that uprising, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 was made. It was essentially a peace treaty at the time. And to say, to satisfy the Indigenous allies of Chief Pontiac, that their insistence was that we're partners here. We don't want a king. We want a partnership. And so the King of England at the time issued that Royal Proclamation, which satisfied that this was not to be a kingdom, but was rather to be a partnership. That certainly changed. Now, during this time, dominance over North American territory was a paramount concern of the various nations wishing to settle it. The view of the newcomers was that Indigenous nations in eastern North America were attractive allies in the contest to colonize. Indigenous nations wanting to defend their lands, I've already read that. However, since these early recognitions, unilateral British and Canadian government policy, legislation, and jurisprudence have discarded those foundational principles and ignored or misstated the treaties that enshrined them. The colonial government and church began to describe Indigenous people as ignorant, with superstitious blindness, in need of emancipation. It became the duty of enlightened Canadians to elevate them from their condition of savagery and their present state of ignorance, superstition, and helplessness. Out of this institutionalized bias, images, terminology, policies, and legislation evolved, which set First Nations people apart both geographically, for example, on reserves, and socially as inferior peoples. This colonization rested on a long-standing tradition in British imperial policy in which, quote, a dominant migrant group attracted by sparsely populated land in a temperature zone drive back the natives and set up small family farms that need no outside labor. Since they are not needed, the surviving natives are put on reserves. This total dominance would lead either to the extinction of the native, or if he were to survive, to the creation of plural cultures within the state. Sounds familiar. They did that all over the world. One critical issue of concern by colonists was First Nations self-government. The independence of tribal government was identified by the colonial government as a serious hindrance to its progress. This was an issue the colonists believed that had to end. at the formation of Canada in 1867 through Section 9124 of the British North America Act and the passage of legislation in 1869, the government set out its vision of future Canada-First Nations relations, 1869. This vision included the continuation of the aggressive mission of assimilation of the first inhabitants. In furtherance of this mission, there was the additional tool now of Section 9124, the Constitution of Canada, which legitimized the creation of Indians as wards of the state. Under this law, the new federal parliament was granted exclusive legislative jurisdiction over Indians and lands reserved for the Indians. Through succeeding Indian legislation, a colonial structure evolved in which the federal Department of Indian Affairs assumed virtually total control over the lives of First Nations people and their communities. Traditional forms of Aboriginal government were abolished and replaced with a male-only elective system. Chiefs and councillors served at the pleasure of the Crown and could be removed by the governor for dishonesty, intemperance, or immorality. First Nations traditional government was ended and placed under the control of the local Indian agent. Moving forward, the Canadian government next proceeded to impose its own set of rules on all First Nations people through comprehensive legislation that in 1876 was our first Indian Act. This represented what is commonly viewed as the first iteration of that legislation, the Indian Act, and of course we still have it today. It adopted an explicit vision of assimilation which First Nations people would leave behind their Indian status and traditional cultures and become full members of the broader Canadian society. As one writer put it, it is in this context that Aboriginal people were viewed in law as children, wards of the state to which the government had a paternalistic duty to protect and civilize. Until 1951, the Indian Act defined a person as an individual other than an Indian. And Indians were legislatively created, as I said, wards of the state. This was actually confirmed by the Supreme Court of Canada in 1950 in a case called St. Anne's Island, where the court held, quote, "The language of the Indian Act embodies the accepted view that these Aborigines are, in effect, wards of the state, whose care and welfare are a political trust of the highest obligation. For that reason, every such dealing with their privileges must bear the imprint of governmental approval." The reality of the Indian legislation, as described again by John Malloy, is that, quote, "alone amongst all other residents and future immigrants to Canada, Indians were a legal construct imposed by Ottawa with almost no reference to Indian custom and experience or the ways in which First Nations people might want to arrange their relations with the mixed bloods and other ethnic peoples who would enter their lives, families, and communities," end of quote. Now, to complete the need to have total control over the first inhabitants, it became obvious that there was a need to define the Indigenous interest in the land so that it too was in the control of the colonial regime. This was finally favorably resolved by the colonial courts in the 1888 case of St. Catharines Milling and Lumber Company. This case decided that since the Royal Proclamation of 1763, Indians held their lands collectively and solely for their use and benefit, and at the goodwill of the sovereign. That is, ownership of the land was held by the Crown, which it granted use of to the Indians for their benefit, and I suggest that the Crown decides what that benefit is. Moreover, this grant of use was not out of any legal obligation, but as a political obligation free from any judicial control. And at that time, the state of our law was that Parliament was supreme, and we have felt that for years in the treaties, because it was legally accurate to say that the Crown could enter into a treaty, and did so with many First Nations, especially on the prairies, and then the next day pass legislation to take back what they promised in the treaties. It was called parliamentary supremacy. And Parliament could take away with one hand what it gave on the other by merely enactment, and the courts could do nothing about it. The court in St. Catharines Milling relied on an American case decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1823, which itself relied on an international principle called the Doctrine of Discovery. That is to say, an instruction only, issued in 1452 by the Catholic Church, the Pope, granting European countries the right to claim and conquer lands. These papal instructions, called papal bulls, authorized countries to, quote, search out and subdue all Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery for the monarch's use and profit. This is what's referred to by the term Doctrine of Discovery. Now, scholars and writers have noticed that the impact of discovery, as it made its way through the Americas, brought with it European diseases to native tribes and peoples that at times wiped out entire populations and civilizations. It legitimized the slavery and shipping of Africans to the New World and the oppression of other ethnic groups. Always, it was justified on two major premises. One, bringing Christianity to the savages and heathens of the New World, and two, the belief that one race had the divine right and superiority to civilize the world and expand their reach. Well, today you should know that it's universally considered a legal fiction and should be abolished of having any sense of reality and application in law. But it's still there. Nevertheless, the circle was now complete. I might add, the reason that Canada can't affirm UNDRIP in its totality is because of the constitutional provision that we have. It can't conform to all of the statements and obligations in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, because the Constitution of Canada says they can name who an Indian is. They can decide what an Indian person's life is, and until such time as that constitutional amendment is gone or somehow deemed null and void, UNDRIP can't be ratified in totality by Canada. Nevertheless, the circle, for our purposes, was now complete. The colonial powers had vested themselves with complete control over the first inhabitants of Canada and their lands. The relationship that involved and that exists today is one in which non-Indians, through legislation such as the Indian Act, regulate practically all aspects of an Indian person's life, virtually from cradle to grave. Indians were created as wards of the state, which still continues today. Second, Indigenous peoples' interest in their original territory is one of a kind and amounts to a mere burden on Crown title. It is not now or ever was ownership. Three, Indigenous rights are not absolute and are capable of regulation by federal legislation and infringement by both the provincial and federal Crown. And the fourth, the treaties are also one of a kind and amount to some form of contract subject to strict interpretation, not international in nature. That's the state of our law. First Nations people, Indigenous people, are Canadian citizens minus. Put another way, we are less equal in law than other Canadians. We are strangers in our own lands. This is what the colonial government created, all of which is supported by constitutional law, and it exists today. The late Mohawk scholar, Patricia Montour Angus, provides a very thought-provoking comment which should raise alarm bells about the legal status assigned to First Nations people and the government policy established to deliver on it. This is what she said. My concerns about law are similar to my concerns about education. Both the systems of law and education that we now live under have been forced upon us. Law and education are two of the central institutions of processes through which First Nations have been colonized and oppressed. There are similar patterns in both systems of order. I think the following will demonstrate that Professor Montour Angus had every reason to be concerned. Law and education have been colonial tools that have resulted in the following. In the 1800s, the colonial government, in furtherance of protection of the savages, established a policy to aggressively assimilate them into English-speaking Christian society. To accomplish this, the government developed a policy of government-funded residential schools to be carried out and run by the churches. After Confederation, Canada continued this policy under the legal authority granted itself in the Indian Act. In all, about 150,000 Aboriginal children were compulsorily removed from their communities and forced to attend their schools. And you know this, I know. But if the parents actually refused to surrender their kids to those residential schools, they were committing a crime. They could be arrested and prosecuted for not giving their children over to the residential schools. And heaven forbid they should ever allow them to come home. Sorry, somebody said, we can get angry but not vexed or something like that. But I have trouble sometimes. As most of you must surely know, the intention of the Indian residential school policy was, and again the language of the state, kill the Indian in the child and save the man. So they're, while that heinous intent failed, the legacy of the policy, described as one of the darkest chapters in Canada's history, caused horrific harm to the school's students. The consequences of the harm and pain caused to the children are now known to be intergenerational, in that its relentless negative impact continues to affect their parents, children, and extended family of schools, students to this day, and it manifests itself in many harmful ways to First Nations people and their communities. And so that you know it's not some kind of historic, somewhere back in the dark ages. The last school closed in 1996. I often tell the story about when I first got involved in Indigenous issues in the Aboriginal Canadian relationship. I worked for a political organization, back then they were called political organizations, called the Association of Iroquois and Allied Indians. And what was really interesting about that, in the early 70s, my first office, and I was the only person, employee at the time for the association, I was the executive director, was in a place called the Mohawk Institute. And if any of you know, that Mohawk Institute was a residential school. And it was empty. And they had caretakers, all from Six Nations, who used to take care of the place. And they would come by and visit me in my office and keep me company. And they would tell me all the stories that they went through, because they were all residential school survivors. And they used to tell me the stories. And I don't know if any of you have ever sat down to dinner or had a beer with Aboriginal people or First Nations people. You always know that they laugh. And we tell our histories, and we tell our tragedies, and we tell all of those horrible things that happened to us. And we laugh, and that's how those gentlemen used to come and tell me the stories of the residential school. They would come into my office and just hilariously laugh. I remember one story. His name was Jakes. I don't remember what his real name is, but he loved the name Jakes, and he was Jakes. And he came in and he was telling his story, and he was laughing. He said, one day they got me, and he says, and they wanted to punish me, so they put me up in these, in the tower, because they had, the Mohawk Institute has these little turret towers that they're up there, and they had shingles on it. And he said, and the one thing they didn't know, they're not very big, they're about as big as this podium, I guess. And he had to stay up there in this little tower. And he said he had him though, because one of the things they didn't know was he could turn those slats and he could see out and he could see the cars coming and going. And he thought that was pretty funny. Because he put one over on him. Well, going forward, as if this were not dreadful enough, we as a people have been subjected to other ongoing forms of nefarious trauma, as we have recently learned from 1942 to 1952, the government sanctioned life-threatening nutrition experiments on Indigenous children at 6 residential schools across Canada. For those inhumane experiments, neither the parents nor the children were given an opportunity to decline participation, nor were they asked to provide their consent. Next is the 60 Scoop, another aspect of Canada's policy of assimilation and protection of its crown wards is known as 60 Scoop. That term, 60 Scoop, was coined by Patrick Johnston, who was the author of the 1983 report, Native Children and the Child Welfare System. It refers to a particular phase of a larger history of the practice of removing Aboriginal children from their families and into state care, and not to an explicit government policy. The overrepresentation of Aboriginal children in the child welfare system simply accelerated and became more drastic in the 1960s. From the 1960s until the late 1980s, an unusually high number of Aboriginal children were apprehended and fostered or adopted out, usually into white families. By the 1970s, roughly 1/3 of all children in care were Aboriginal, and approximately 70% of them were placed into non-Aboriginal homes. It is estimated that up to 18,000 First Nation, Inuit, and Métis children were adopted or fostered to non-Native homes during this period. Even today, First Nations families are 5 times more likely to be investigated, and their children are 12 times more likely to be placed in foster care than non-First Nations children. The last thing I want to just quickly talk about is the imprisonment of Indigenous peoples. And you'll know about this. While the issue of overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in Canada's prisons is not a specific government policy, at its core is the influence and effects of government policy, including, and perhaps especially, the policies that I just discussed. The truth of this can be found in the language and findings of fact in the unprecedented Supreme Court of Canada decisions. In 1999, the Supreme Court in Gladue found that there was a drastic overrepresentation of Indigenous people within both the Canadian criminal population and the criminal justice system. It labeled this reality in 1999 a crisis in the Canadian criminal justice system. In 1999. In deciding Gladue, the court found that there was widespread racism in Canada toward Indigenous people that has manifested itself as systemic discrimination in the criminal justice system. It held that courts must take judicial notice of such matters as the history of colonialism, displacement, and residential schools, and how that history continues to translate into lower educational attainment, lower incomes, higher unemployment, higher rates of substance abuse and suicide, and of course higher levels of incarceration of Aboriginal people. In 2012, 13 years later, in a case called R versus Ipeely, the Supreme Court again examined the effects of its decision in Gladue. It found that statistics were growing worse. Gladue and Ipili both acknowledge that excessive imprisonment of Aboriginal people is only the tip of the iceberg insofar as the estrangement of the Aboriginal peoples from the Canadian criminal justice system is concerned. Now, in spite of the Supreme Court's two, what I say, are groundbreaking decisions, here's the reality today. While Indigenous people make up about 4% of the overall population of Canada, 27 to 28% of the total federal inmate population claims Indigenous ancestry. Indigenous women represent 36% of all federally sentenced women in Canada. And it's worse yet still for youthful offenders. I don't get it. In a recent report of the Office of the Correctional Investigator of Canada, cautioned that, quote, current sentencing trends combined with a growing and youthful demographic indicate that over-representation of Aboriginal people in Canada's correctional system is likely to grow. Since 2005-06, the Indigenous inmate population has increased by over 40%. More than half of the daily inmate count at several institutions in the Prairie region is Indigenous. Half. It is noteworthy that in 2012, Amanda Gebhardt of the University of Toronto pointed out that discipline is deeply rooted in the history of education of Aboriginal people and cautions that it should not be assumed that schools today are void of their oppressive elements of the past. She notes that research has demonstrated that racial disparity in school discipline and achievement mirrors racially disproportionate minority confinement. She then observes that while both the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in custody and their low levels of educational achievement are well documented, less clear are the ways in which Aboriginal students are disproportionately targeted for punishment in their schools and how their treatment in schools is part of a process that sets them up for a future of imprisonment. Now, I firmly believe that this current relationship is responsible for relegating First Nations people in Canada to being the poorest of poor in their own land. Because of it, we will continue to live shorter and less healthy lives than other Canadians, be less educated and less employed as compared to others, and will continue to be systemically discriminated against by the criminal justice system and imprisoned at a significantly higher rate than other Canadians. As First Peoples, our lives remain desolate, with little hope of improvement if we continue to be constitutionalized as wards of the state with no real title to our lands. The current Canadian approach, steeped in the historical renderings of First Nation peoples as wards of the state, that is less equal than other Canadians, has left us as the poorest of the poor. It has created the framework in which atrocities such as the Indian residential school system and the 60s school could take place. In European-dominated society, First Nations people always have and apparently always will have a better chance of going to prison than finishing high school. The reality of Canada's policy of defining and implementing its relationship with Indigenous people cannot be defined with more clarity than through the words of retired Supreme Court of Canada Justice Beverly McLaughlin. On May 28, 2015 in Toronto, at the 4th Annual Pluralism Lecture of the Global Center for Pluralism, I don't know what that means, she said, quote, the most glaring blemish on the Canadian historic record relates to our treatment of the First Nations that lived here at the time of colonization. She noted that after an initial period of interreliance and equality, Canada developed an ethos of exclusion and cultural annihilation. Recently, as I wrap up, you'll be happy to know, recently Justice Rosalie Abella of our Supreme Court, writing about the Holocaust, had this to say, quote, "We cannot undo history, but we can, as a generation humbled by its awesome power, contribute to a powerful momentum against its repetition." I would add to this, momentum to fix it. The most significant contribution should be to teach the true history of the Indigenous Canadian relationship and its tragic and devastating consequences. Throughout my life, I have heard too many people, some believe themselves to be the best educated in Canada, tell me I'm ashamed of my country for never having taught this truth. I am so sorry that I had never learned of it. I recently read an email my wife Janice received from the U.S. Holocaust Museum describing its efforts in commemoration and education. It was titled, "Memory and Action." In this regard, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people alike need to be educated so that our collective memory is true and correct. But memory alone is insufficient. Memory has been twinned with action by the U.S. Holocaust Museum. Action must accompany memory. Action such as what you are undertaking in this symposium. And regardless of any government's political will to do so, it can and should nevertheless be done. It should be taught beginning at the earliest level of school and continue throughout the successive grades and levels. And in the end, not only must the truth be taught and learned, but we must act upon it so that we can fix it. That is the importance of Indigenous education in Ontario classrooms. And the like-minded allies we as First Peoples can lead this, and from what I see from all present here today, we can do it. And it's memory and action. Jimmy Welch, thank you very much.
Chief.
Feel some time.
We're on Indian time.
We have a token of our respect for Harry, but Harry couldn't be here today, so I'd like to accept this on his behalf. So, listen, Harry, we really appreciate it, if I can call you Harry.
Yeah.
We really appreciate you coming and doing this and talking for us and being a part of this conference. So, if you wouldn't mind coming up and would you mind welcoming Harry again to the floor? So, the next time, and I've seen you all stand up, so the next time I speak here, I'm not leaving the floor until you stand up.
That is good.
Could you ask when you're leaving at noon or when you're around that we can get some pictures of that? Oh, you too.
Oh, here. Excuse my back.
like the shirt.
You gotta fill some time.
It's always right in the office.
Sure.
I just wanted to thank everybody for coming and to tell you that lunch is ready. If you're a speaker or an elder or an honored guest, then lunch will be served on the 3rd floor. So you can just go over to the elevators and take it up to the 3rd floor. There'll be volunteers to show you to the rooms. For everybody else, the sandwich boxes are already made up outside. Since there's so many people, we're hoping you could just grab a box and then head up to the 2nd and the 3rd floor. There's seating all over the floors, and then you can also eat your lunches in your breakout sessions. There's also vendors selling artisans, selling arts and crafts and jewelry and skirts and something beautiful. I encourage you to go through there. And there's also 2 displays, one from the Mississaugas and the other moccasin identifier display.
We will be back recording live at 3:30. Thank you.